programs there at the NAS, and I'm the regular host of this webinar, Restoring the Sciences. We hear quite a bit these days that science is under attack, especially in the realm of science and public policy. And in this world, you're usually either, quote, following the science, unquote, or if you're not, then you're quote, a science denier, unquote. And as a scientist myself, I look aghast on this silliness in no large part because no one seems to have a clue about what science actually is, how scientists work, and their motivations. No one who is actually flinging these charges, just to be clear. So the question is science really under attack? And if so, who's leading the charge and to what end? Our guest today will be addressing these questions. Lawrence Krauss has a distinguished academic career as a theoretical physicist and cosmologist. He's been a professor at Yale University, and he retired as emeritus professor in 2018 from Arizona State University, and he earned his PhD from Harvard University. While he was at Arizona State, Lawrence Krauss founded and served as director of the Origins Project, which explores deep questions about the origin of the universe. And he's also a prominent advocate of the public understanding of science and of the political storms that are swirling around the academic sciences today. He's a prolific author. He's written several books, including The Physics of Star Trek, which he co-authored with Stephen Hawking, A Universe from Nothing, and The Physics of Climate Change, among other books, and several other popular and technical books as well. He's also a frequent contributor to high-profile journals like Quillette, and he writes regularly on his Critical Mass Substack. He also is unusual in having his own IMDb profile. I'll be putting some links to several of these items in the chat box, so do have a look at some point and copy and paste them at some point during the webinar. And just for information's sake, we'll also be putting these links in the YouTube video once it goes live today. Okay, so we're pleased to have Lawrence Krauss as a guest on Restoring the Sciences. We'll be starting with a presentation that he has titled appropriately, Science Under Attack. Before we launch into that, though, let me just give us a few housekeeping details. Once Lawrence's presentation is done, we'll be opening up the floor to questions from you, the audience, and we'll go until about 4:30 Eastern Time with Q&A. We'd like you to post these questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, beg your pardon. We can also take questions in the chat box, but we just prefer Q&A because it's a bit more interactive. And let me just also say that we can take these questions at any time. You don't have to wait for the Q&A session to start to put your questions in. Okay, with that introduction, Lawrence Krauss, welcome to Restoring the Sciences. We're really glad you're here. And take it away.
Well, thanks a lot. It's a great pleasure and honor to be asked to do this. You only got one thing. I mean, there were probably other little things, but MIT will object. I got my PhD at MIT, not Harvard. I moved to Harvard.
Oh, that's
MIT.
right.
It's all right.
That's right.
Given the rivalry, I thought I should at least clarify that. There are other things, but in any case, it is a pleasure to be here and to be asked to do this. I've lectured on the subject of a variety of places, and I thought, in the context of this, I would try and redo it and make it extremely current. So I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to start sharing my slides. There's so much to talk about. I just spent last half hour cutting slides out before we began because I think there's too much. But I'll try and go through it relatively quickly to give you lots of fodder for questions, and I hope to provoke questions. I don't think that'll be a problem. So let's do that. Hopefully I'm now sharing the screen with you. And the title of my talk is Science Under Attack, and I thought I'd give it a subtitle, The Postmodern Ideological Corruption of Science, to make it even more explicit. And as was pointed out, I'm now the president of the Origins Project Foundation that tries to link science and culture, which should be linked more than they are. That's all I'll say about that for the moment. I want to start historically with some object lessons from different times, and maybe it'll give a sense of my own, in the case of full disclosure, my own background. So I started out in the early, or actually almost mid-'80s, as an assistant professor of physics at physics and astronomy at Yale. And up on Science Hill, I remember we used to look down the hill with derision at that what the English department and other departments where deconstructionism was in vogue, and we used to scoff at it because it appeared to us that there weren't sort of the same kind of intellectual standards. I remember laughing and saying, because it was the arguments that were going on among deconstructionists about language was epitomized by a postmodernist movement that argued against the existence of objective truth and argued that all such claims to knowledge were tainted by ideological biases due to race, sex, or economic dominance. Essentially arguing that power and oppression were at the root of everything. And every bit of knowledge had to be viewed within that lens. We laughed and told ourselves it could never happen in the sciences. Now, in fact, a little over a decade later, for the younger people, you may not remember this, the older people will, a mathematician, Alan Sokal, in 1996, published what turned out to be a spoof paper. And it was reported eventually, once he announced it as a spoof, after it was accepted and appeared in the social science journal Social Choice, announced it as a spoof. It became a big issue, front page stories in the New York Times, etc. The title of his paper was Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. And it was a nonsense paper, and the idea was to try and intersperse random terms from string theory and mathematics and quantum gravity in a kind of social justice framework. Here's an example of the language. Most recently, feminist and post-structural critiques have demystified the substantive content of mainstream Western scientific practice, revealing the ideology of domination concealed behind the facade of objectivity. Physical reality, no less than social reality, is at bottom a social and linguistic construct. Scientific knowledge reflects and encodes the dominant ideologies and power relations of the culture that produced it. The scientific community cannot assert a privileged epistemological status with respect to counter-hegemonic narratives emanating from dissident or marginalized communities. And at the time, it once again, it seemed like the whole content of this should have been recognized to be a spoof, but it wasn't. And many people had laughed. Many people were quite upset, actually, that he'd submitted to a social science journal and been accepted, but that was the point of his spoof, like it or not. Okay, let's jump ahead now, 27 years, and see what's happening now in science. In the Journal of Chemical Education, there's a paper that discusses a special topics class in chemistry on feminism and science as a tool to disrupt the disconscious racism in STEM. Here's a quote from that article. This article presents an argument on the importance of teaching science with a feminist framework and defines it by acknowledging that all knowledge is historically situated and is influenced by social power and politics. Then my note, included in the context of the course is, and then quoting from the article again, to explore the development and interrelationship between quantum mechanics, Marxist materialism, Afrofuturism and pessimism, and post-colonial nationalism. To problematize time as a linear social construct, the Copenhagen interpretation of the collapse of wave-particle duality was utilized. Okay, I won't comment. I think it speaks for itself. Now, in my own field of physics, in the most prestigious American journal, the Physical Review, an article appeared and after peer review entitled "Observing Whiteness in Introductory Physics: A Case Study." Here's a quote from it. Within whiteness, the organization of social life is in terms of a center and margins that are based on dominance, control, and a transcendent figure that is consistently and structurally ascribed value over and above other figures. Again, my note, among the groundbreaking discussions of the paper, going back to the article, quote, entangled with the above is the use of whiteboards as a primary pedagogical tool. They also play a role in reconstituting whiteness as a social organization. They collaborate with white organizational culture where ideas and experiences gain value when written down. And so whiteboards as a tool of racism. At the Joint Mathematics Meeting, which is the largest math congress in the world, a paper was given entitled Undergraduate Mathematics Education as a White cis heteropatriarchal space and opportunities for structural disruption to advance queer or I think it's queer or social justice. I think that's an one never knows whether there are typos in these titles. And then this is an interesting one to give a sense of the, you might think of these as fringe papers, in spite of the fact that they're published in the prime journals of scientific organizations. The National Academy of Sciences, of which I'll speak later, awarded one of their highest awards for science communication to a physicist whose writing included an article entitled "Making Black Women Scientists Under White Empiricism: The Racialization of Epistemology in Physics." Here's a quote from it. "Black women must, according to Einstein's principle of covariance, have an equal claim to objectivity regardless of their simultaneously experiencing intersecting axes of oppression." Not only is this gobbledygook, it clearly demonstrates a pretty poor understanding of Einstein's principle of covariance. And it literally could have that sentence could have come straight out of Sokal. In 1996, those sentences were the subject of great humor and comedy, and people laughed that people could take this seriously, and they've moved from that fringe domain into the heart of science in some ways. Now, this would be just comical or maybe amusing. I'm going to call that kind of thing woke science, and I don't mean it as I've actually changed my definition. Woke itself is not intrinsically, in my opinion, bad. It's based on ideas of trying to be aware of social inequities. In principle, it's motivated by the idea of equality. I've coined a term called fundamentalist wokeism, which I think is like fundamentalist Islam is to Islam, which I think is dangerous. But the whole idea of woke science is itself an oxymoron. That's my point. And it would be comical but the problem is that these kind of nonsensical discussions are being carried out in the context of an academic and scientific system that's being corrupted itself and stifled by ideology. And that turns comedy into tragedy. And I want to give lots of examples. Actually, before I go back to Lawrence Summers, I'm going to go to Lawrence Summers, who was the president of Harvard a while back. And he makes a statement which actually 5 years ago might have shocked me, but I now think is of great importance. It's actually a statement that came out in an op-ed piece, not by him, but by someone else in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago. Universities need to abandon the concept that they have a central role in moral education. It's a remarkable statement because many of us like to think that we are producing in universities more quote unquote moral people by introducing critical thinking into their life. And maybe that hope is there, but we're not there to guide their moral development. And I think his point is really, it only began to hit me in the context of everything I'm going to say in the process of preparing this lecture, that this notion that people have that universities have to play a central role in moral education, which isn't, again, sounds like a good thing, is insidious and has produced many bad side effects. The article it came from was written by Heather McDonald, who's a critic of many features of what one might call woke ideology. But here's a quote from that paper, and I think it's also important. "A university has no capacity to eliminate hate, nor should that be its mission. In the name," this was, of course, played out in the context of what's going on university campuses right now regarding Israel and Gaza. "A university has no capacity to eliminate hate, nor should that be its mission. In the name of rejecting hate, colleges built their DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracies in the first place, and allowed bureaucrats and their faculty sympathizers to put certain facts and ideas off limits. In the name of rejecting hate, colleges started requiring faculty, even in the hard sciences, to justify their research in the name of inclusion and belonging." And we'll see how that's one of the contexts I want to discuss and how it's impacted on the scientific processes. So I want to talk about the sociology of science, scientific infrastructure, academic freedom and cancellation, and woke science, and how it's becoming embedded in the scientific enterprise itself. So the narrative that we're dealing with right now, which is widely accepted without without evidence, is that science itself is intrinsically, systemically sexist and racist. And that has impacted on science and academia at all levels. And I'll just give you some examples. Take scientific societies, my own American Physical Society. In June 2020, now, the APS represents 55,000 physicists worldwide. It endorsed a strike for Black lives, organized in part by a group called Particles for Justice, to, quote, shut down STEM in academia. It closed its office not to protest police violence or racism, but to, quote, commit to eradicating systemic racism and discrimination, especially in academia and science, stating that, quote, physics is not an exception to the suffocating effects of racism in American life. The assumption made that physics is racist, okay, and it's systemic in academia. Now, this is rather interesting. This led them to, as a scientific society, make certain claims about what's good for science. In December 2020, the APS sent out a letter to its membership arguing that at the time Donald Trump's presidential executive order on combating race and sex stereotypes was, quote, in direct opposition to the core values of the American Physical Society. Now, one might imagine that it was, given whose executive order it was, but in fact, the APS argued that the order needed to be rescinded in order to, quote, strengthen America's scientific enterprise. The order, which of course has since been rescinded by Biden, quoted Martin Luther King, stating that in government-supported scientific institutions, people should, quote, not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The order also argued that materials from places like Argonne National Laboratory that equate, quote, colorblindness and meritocracy with actions of bias, or from Sandia National Laboratories, which state that an emphasis on rationality over emotionality is a characteristic of white males. That executive order suggested these were inappropriate training materials for government-supported science institutions. What's important here is that the APS argued that the context of that order was in direct opposition to the core values of the American Physical Society, and removing it would strengthen American scientific enterprise. Okay, so already you're beginning to see the intrusion of ideology in the statements of a scientific society, whether you agree with them or not. In Princeton, at that same year, more than 100 faculty members, including more than 40 in the sciences and engineering, wrote an open letter to the president with proposals to, quote, disrupt the institutional hierarchies perpetrating inequity and harm. This included the creation of a policing committee that would oversee the investigation and discipline of racist behaviors, incidents, research, and publication on the part of faculty, with, quote, racism to be defined by another faculty committee, and requiring every department, including math, physics, astronomy, and other sciences, to establish a senior thesis prize for research that somehow, quote, is actively anti-racist or expands our sense of how race is constructed in our society. So if you're a string theorist, if a young person doing mathematical physics on string theory in 11 dimensions, you need to incorporate in your senior thesis showing it's actively anti-racist or expands our sense of how race is constructed in our society. Let's go to that National Academy of Sciences, which used to be a great institution. One half of the members of the 2021 class, 59 of 120, are women. Not a coincidence. A major lever for change has been the Academy's governing council. It divides the new members, allocated each year among 6 classes. We assign slots based on the diversity of the list of nominees that's been forwarded, not the merit or the subject area. Wessler says classes presenting a more diverse lists get extra slots. And then the next year afterwards, the council reviews how the slots have been filled and adjusts the distribution based on performance. Quote, if the selectors use them to pick a bunch of white guys from Harvard, they get penalized. So there's the selection for the National Academy of Sciences, which has always been political in one way or another, is now explicitly political and with a quota system. Let's look at scientific administration from the highest levels of the country down to the level of universities. Francis Collins, who's a who has been a friend. I've known him for a while. Was director of the National Institutes of Health, the largest single agency supporting scientific research in the country. A few years ago, while he was director, he's no longer director, he apologized for the existing, quote, structural racism in biomedical research and pledged to address the problem with sweeping changes. He did so at the behest of an advisory committee to the director working group report that called on the NIH to, quote, acknowledge the prevalence of racism and anti-Blackness in the scientific workforce. He wasn't alone. The heads of almost every major scientific organization pledged that their organizations were racist. What I find at the time and still now particularly hypocritical about this, or at least an evidence of virtue signaling rather than anything real, is that if Francis Collins really believed that the organization that he led has been racist during the entire time he led it, the appropriate thing to do would be to resign. It's virtue signaling. Now let's get to academic hiring, where this has affected a lot. And several years ago, one began to see an additional criteria in advertisements for faculty openings. As a recent Cornell ad puts it, also required is a statement of diversity, equity, and inclusion, describing the applicant's efforts and aspirations to promote equity, inclusion, and diversity through teaching, research, and service. It sounds sort of innocuous until it becomes required, and the reviewing of that statement determines your future. In 2021, when I did a survey, when I wrote this particular slide the first time without the grammatical errors I now see, of the 25 most recent advertisements for junior faculty that appeared in Physics Today, that was October 15th of that year, from research institutions like Caltech to liberal arts colleges like Bryn Mawr, and even in areas as esoteric as quantum engineering and theoretical astrophysics, 24 required applicants to demonstrate an explicit and active commitment to the DEI agenda. These are people who've been graduate students and postdocs working presumably day and night in the laboratory or at the computer or wherever, getting their PhDs and trying to get research out to try and be attractive, who have really most of them have never much thought about teaching as anything else. They now have to demonstrate not just that they're not, quote, racist, but they have an active commitment and with history to demonstrate it to the DI agenda defined by the bureaucracies of the universities. Now, this is not just a supplement. The Life Sciences Department at the University of California, Berkeley reported that year that it rejected 76% of the applicants in 2018 and 2019 based on their diversity statements without looking at their research records. The first thing that was done was look at the diversity statements, and if they didn't cut above the line, you didn't look to see whether they were good scientists or not. So this is not just an appendage. It's not an extra add-on to program. It's a central feature of academic hiring at that time. And a colleague, and this is many colleagues at major research institutions wrote me, but one of them in particular wrote me and said, I have a student on the market this year agonizing more on the diversity statement than on their research proposal. A common experience. Now, the big hero here is actually from the National Association of Scholars. It's John Saylor, who recently produced an article which appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and a longer report I assume is coming, looking at 800 Freedom of Information Act for 800 diversity reports from Ohio State University, and found that the diversity reports required search committees to describe how their proposed finalists would, quote, would amplify the values of diversity, inclusion, and innovation. Okay, sounds not too bad. An applicant to be a professor of nuclear physics could understand the plight of minorities in academia because he was married to an immigrant in Texas in the age of Trump. This is the level of the kind of selection process that we're seeing. A committee searching for a professor of freshwater biology selected finalists, quote, based upon a weighted rubric of 67% research and 33 contribution to DEI. So already you're seeing DEI having a significant fraction. If you got 0 in your DEI contribution, there's essentially 0 likelihood that your research contribution would be considered for a very competitive faculty position. To evaluate the statements, the committee used a rubric that cited several problematic approaches for which a candidate can receive a 0 score. For example, if he solely acknowledges that racism, classism, etc., are issues in the academy, that's not good enough. For research in astrophysics, this is amazing to me. The DEI statement was given equal weight to the research and teaching statements. So the statement of how actively your research will be anti-racist was given equal weight to research and teaching for people in astrophysics. Okay. And in the search for a professor of chemistry, the report notes that one candidate's, quote, experiences as a queer neurodivergent Latinx woman in STEM has provided her with an important motivation to expand DEI efforts beyond simply representation and instead towards social justice. Social justice being the issue here, being promoted by the university and being required by candidates regardless of their background, politics, etc. Another report concedes that as a white male, one proposed finalist does not outwardly present as a diversity candidate, so probably shouldn't be considered. However, in his defense, it noted that he recently published on critical race theory, obviously something of great importance for a professor of chemistry. Now in Canada, where I happen to live now, most of my teaching career, all of my teaching career and research career has been in the United States, and with visiting positions at various places around the world. In Canada, there is no sort of constitutional objection to explicit racism or sexism, as long as the racism or sexism is done to combat previous racism or sexism. So, for example, at the University of Waterloo, here's an advertisement for a position and an assistant professor in faculty of environment. Actually, a Canada Research Chair, the highest level of research chairs open in Canada. This call is opened only to qualified individuals who self-identify as women, transgender, non-binary, or two-spirit, whatever that is. The University of Guelph had a Canada Research Chair in experimental physics, and the first part of it sounds exactly like you'd expect for an advertisement in experimental physics. The successful candidate will be an outstanding and innovative world-class researcher in experimental physics whose accomplishments have made a major impact on the field. Great. However, candidates who apply must be from one or more of the following equity-seeking groups: women, persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, and racialized groups. So the part about being outstanding and innovative is only a small part of it. You have to also be have your identity checked before you can be considered. For Canada Research Chairs itself, which Canada created, I know as a former Canadian who moved to the United States, Canada Research Chairs were created to try and encourage Canadians in particular who studied abroad or had positions abroad to come back and work in Canada. It was a good idea and successful, but it's changed because of the requirements. Queen's University recently advertised for a research chair in geotechnical engineering. It's open to applicants of any race as long as the applicants self-identify as women. At McGill, a tenure-track position indicated, quote, a demonstrated relevance of the candidate's work to addressing anti-Black racism or systemic inequities will be regarded as an important asset. Background in critical race theory is desirable but not required. What field was this ad in? Computer science. Now, Canada itself has decided to put quotas on research chairs. New quotas. Research chairs now must match exactly the demographics of not the applicant pool in the field, but of the general population. By 2029, 50.9% of Canada research chairs must be women and gender minorities. 22% must be racialized minorities, 7.5% must be people with disabilities, and 4.9% must be Indigenous, regardless of the pool of qualified candidates. Some university recruitment efforts, including in fields that have little to do with identity, such as quantum computing, computational biology, now flat out exclude white males who don't self-identify as disabled or LGBT+. In particular, University of Toronto, what some people would say is its leading university, recently announced that all recruiting for Canada research chairs will be restricted to the aforementioned designated groups, that means minoritized groups, in regard to engineering, dentistry, medicine, and other disciplines. In Australia, going around the Commonwealth, I wrote an article a while ago about the National Medical and Health Research Council, which is Australia's version of the NIH. This is a long story, but to make it short, they've decided to award half of their research grants for researchers at mid-career and senior levels to women and non-binary applicants. So half of the grants will go to women and non-binary applicants, in spite of the fact that to date, only 20% of the grant proposals come from women. And there's no statistics that I know of about how many come from non-binary applicants. So 20% of the grant proposals come in, 50% have to go to women and non-binary. This system of identity politics and attempting to counter perceived bias by creating new biases is rampant. And here's an example at MIT, where I did my PhD. MIT, for better or worse, has been typically male-dominated because it's been STEM disciplines, and it's typically been male-dominated. That's been changing, but it has been, and many people, myself included, have worked to try and broaden the group of people coming into science. But let's look at the actual positions. The head of the corporation, the president, the provost, the director of research, the chancellor, and the dean of science are all women. 8 departments in the School of Engineering, which is the major school in the university, which again are, for better or worse, male-dominated. 5 of those are chaired by women. Is that a coincidence? It's certainly not representative of the university demographics, and it leads one to seriously ask the question: are these the best people for the jobs, or are people being put in positions because of their identity? Note nationally, the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, this was in 2015, before DEI quotas started becoming prominent, already reported that there was a 2-to-1 preference for hiring women in STEM positions. Though the argument that physics was systemically sexist, for example, against women, certainly didn't seem to be true if you looked at the actual hiring that was going on. And we can see that, you just have to see what happened. Here's a very famous congressional testimony of 2 days where we see the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT, and we see well, we see what we see. Academic freedom. I want to talk about a few cases. Stephen Shu is a physicist I happen to know since I was at Harvard, and Michigan State University. This was at the same time, the same day as the American Physical Society pushed the strike for Black Lives, where it wanted to strike in government facilities and encourage people to have seminars and review racism in science. When that happened at Michigan State University, one group used the strike for Black Lives to organize and coordinate a protest campaign against the vice president for research, physicist Steve Shu, whose crimes included doing research on computational genomics to study how human genetics might be related to cognitive ability, something that to the protesters smacked of eugenics. He was also accused of supporting psychology research at MSU on the statistics of police shooting that didn't clearly support claims of racial bias. Within a week, the university president forced Steve Shu to resign. But it didn't stop there. The people who did the study, which was, by the way, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the authors of the psychology study retracted their paper, not because of flaws in the statistical analysis, but because of what they called the misuse of their article by journalists who argued that it countered the prevailing view that police forces are racist. I have to say that as a physicist who spent a lot of time talking to the journalists about cosmology, that if every time there was if I required that the statements were not misused by journalists, there'd be no cosmology and published in newspapers nowadays. They later amended the retraction request to claim conveniently that it had nothing to do with political considerations, mob pressure, threats to the authors, or distaste for the political views of people citing the work approvingly. Well, Dorian Abbott is another famous case. He's at the University of Chicago. He was giving a public lecture at MIT's Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences. They canceled the prestigious Carlson public lecture because Dorian had turned out to have expressed a dissenting opinion, not about climate change, which is what the whole public event was supposed to be about, but he argued in a Newsweek piece that universities' obsession with diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, threatened to derail their primary mission, the production and dissemination of knowledge. An opinion which you can agree with or disagree with, but in principle should not be an opinion that causes someone to be removed as a speaker on a public lecture on climate change. Here's another Canadian example, Frances Widdowson. I want to use examples to show it's not all men here. Frances, she attended a talk by a professor of Native American Studies at the University of New Mexico, at her university, Mount Royal University in Alberta. In this talk, the speaker was discussing Indigenous star knowledge and its importance for educational institutions. She asked the following question, quote, "I'm just wondering about your thoughts on how this material with respect to astronomy could be incorporated into, for example, astronomy classes or other science classes. I'm not quite sure whether this presentation is looking at how Indigenous people understood the stars and so on historically, or whether you think this can actually contribute to existing science courses, especially like astronomy courses. If you don't have a telescope, if those cultures didn't have a telescope, I'm not sure how these stories would be able to contribute to the courses in the actual sciences at Mount Royal. Thank you." Well, this question became the subject of a harassment complaint. At Arts Faculty Council, a colleague said it was basically not a safe space for Indigenous people. And she directed a question to the Dean of Arts saying whether saying that Indigenous science was not science made the university unsafe. That was one of the examples for why she should be fired. It was reported that your conduct at a meeting in the spring of 2021 was so disruptive that it was a significant contributing factor to the development of new procedures at Arts Faculty Council meetings, as well as the disabling of the chat function during these meetings, and she was fired from her tenured position for those statements. John Cormandy, a very distinguished astronomer, retracted an article intended for the publication of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences from a preprint website. His article focused on statistical results related to the evaluation of future impact of astronomers' research as a means to inform decisions on resource allocation, such as job hiring and tenure decisions. The idea was to look at quantitative indicators that search committees might use to try and assess junior researchers to see whether they might have a reasonable chance of doing good work in the future. Online critics attacked Cormandy's use of quantitative metrics, which may be seen as casting doubt on the application of diversity criteria in personnel decisions. He was viciously attacked, and finally, he withdrew the article and the book that was based on the article. And first of all, he said, "I emphasize again that metrics measure the impact that happens, not the impact that should happen. It helps us to understand what happens in the real world. The real world is the only one that we have to live in. My hope is that a healthy, but not excessive, investment in impact measures will make a modest contribution to better science." However, after, you don't have to read the whole thing, after being attacked viciously, he apologized in a very kind of Maoist kind of apology, apologized sincerely for those I hurt, basically. And he didn't have that intention, as I've highlighted here. Intentions do not in the end matter. What matters is that what my actions achieve. And now I see that my work has hurt people. I apologize to you all for the stress and the pain that I have caused. Nothing could have been further from my hopes. Again, it sounds very much like the kind of confessions one sees in various totalitarian or dictatorships. Carol Hooven was a lecturer at Harvard, an evolutionary biologist, was canceled in 2023 this year and eventually forced to resign because she stated that one's sex was biological and binary on a Fox and Friends program. Beatrice Villarreal is a postdoc at the Nordic Institute of Theoretical Physics and now in Stockholm. In her field is astrobiology, a field that you'll see is rife with social justice concerns. The SETI Institute required her to withdraw her grant application for the proposed research she was going to do in optical signatures of potential extraterrestrial civilizations. And she was disinvited from presenting her work at a SETI conference at Penn State. Why? Because she collaborated with an astronomer who had been accused of sexual harassment. Not her, but she had collaborated with it. One of her collaborators had been done that. So they required her to withdraw her grant application and said she could not report on the science that she was doing because she was working with a prescribed individual, or had been, along with a group of other researchers. Elizabeth Weiss is an anthropologist whose experienced, who's basically tried to argue that science should be the central feature of anthropology, and as a result has been viciously attacked. In 2022, she sued San Jose State, where she's a professor. She was removed as curator of the university's collection of remains and locked out of the research facility because she's against the repatriation of ancient bones instead of keeping them for scientific study. This last year, with several co-authors, they'd prepared a session for the annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association. The annual meeting, their session had been accepted, and the session was entitled "Let's Talk About Sex, Baby: What Biological Sex Remains a Necessary Why Biological Sex Remains a Necessary Analytic Category in Anthropology." Well, it was accepted, but when the council reviewed it, they decided to remove the session. The AA leadership decided to remove the session and wrote, "Reached in the spirit of respect for our values, the safety and dignity of our members, and the scientific integrity of the program." That's why they changed their mind. They had to because of concern for the safety and dignity of members of their association. The ideas were advanced in such a way as to cause harm to members represented by the trans and LGBTQI of the anthropological community, as well as the community at large. These ideas are provide harm. They also said they did it to preserve the scientific integrity of the meeting. And as I wrote in an article I wrote about this, to suggest that a spirited discussion of the importance of sex and gender in the context of archaeology threatened the scientific integrity of the program, which is what they explicitly stated, is to misunderstand the nature of science. Science is a dialectic. Science is supposed to be based on spirited discussion of ideas, and to argue that removing that spirited discussion will enhance the scientific integrity of the program is the exact opposite of scientific integrity. Let's look at finally at the scientific enterprise itself. The Royal Society of Chemistry. Here's the Royal Society of Chemistry produces a journal, and the journal editors were given a set of guidelines. A set of guidelines has been produced to help us minimize the risk of publishing inappropriate or otherwise offensive content. Offense is a subjective matter, and sensitivity to it spans a considerable range. However, we bear in mind that is the perception of the recipient that we should consider, regardless of the author's intention. Please consider, and this was the advice given or the command given to editors, please consider whether or not any content, words, depictions, or imagery might have the potential to cause offense, referring to the guidelines as needed. If it has the potential to cause offense, the article shouldn't be published. Offensive content was then further defined. It was defined as any content that could reasonably offend someone on the basis of their age, gender, race, sexual orientation, religious or political beliefs, marital or parental status, physical features, national origin, social status, or disability. It's hard to find anything else that you could possibly talk about that wouldn't possibly offend someone on the basis of that definition. Nature, human behavior. In a editorial entitled "Science Must Respect the Dignity and Rights of All Humans," let me just say the journal said that will reject articles. The journal has said that they will reject articles that might potentially harm, even inadvertently, those individuals or groups most vulnerable to racism, sexism, ableism, or homophobia. So an article that determines something which is true and factual and potentially important scientifically, but might even indirectly or inadvertently harm groups that self-labeled as victims due to racism, sexism, ableism, or homophobia, those scientific articles would not be published in Nature. Take the Department of Energy, which is the major supporter of physical sciences in the United States. Starting in fiscal 2023, every proposal responding to a solicitation from the Office of Science is required to include a peer plan, which stands for Promoting Inclusive and Equitable Research, to describe the activities and strategies of the applicant to promote equity and inclusion as an intrinsic element to advancing the scientific excellence. In the words of the announcement, the complexity and detail of a peer plan is expected to increase with the size of the research team and the number of personnel to be supported. DOE supports particle accelerators and the major particle experimental programs in the country. Some accelerator programs and big experiments at accelerators have thousands of PhD scientists. The support involves tens of millions and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. For those detailed programs, the peer plan will have to be incredibly complex, taking a huge amount of time, money, and effort to talk about how discovering whether neutrinos have CP violation, for example, will promote equity and inclusion as an intrinsic element of scientific excellence. The NSF created a brand new program called Includes, and they had to come up with an acronym. And so the English here is kind of amazing. It stands for Inclusion Across the Nation of Communities of Learners of Underrepresented Discoverers in Engineering and Science. Government speak, or I shouldn't say government speak, some kind of speak. They unveiled a set of big ideas that identify areas for future investments at the frontiers of science and engineering. The big ideas represent unique opportunities to position our nation at the cutting edge of global science and engineering research. Great. And this was one of the big ideas. It's to catalyze the STEM enterprise to work collectively for inclusive change, resulting in a STEM workforce that reflects the diversity of the nation's population. NSF Includes seek to motivate and accelerate collaborative infrastructure building to advance equity and sustain systemic change. No science to talk about there. This major scientific effort doesn't even discuss science itself. A Canadian academic initiative was entitled Decolonizing Light, was sponsored by the New Frontiers and Research Fund, announced its commitment to studying the reproduction of colonialism in and through physics, how colonial scientific knowledge authority was and is still reproduced in the context of light. The description of the program was muddled, and it said physics is considered as hard and objective science, disconnected from social life and geopolitical history. This narrative both constitutes and reproduces inequity, because physics is hard. This just came out last week. The Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Canada has a project for medical education. This is from their site. CanMeds affords us an opportunity to think critically and propose a vision for the practice of medicine, which is rooted in social justice, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and cultural safety, promoting a broader cultural shift which is necessary for the profession. As a profession, we participate, all doctors participate in the perpetuation of structural violence on marginalized groups. But this is the sentence I've underlined. A new model of medical education would seek to center values such as anti-oppression and anti-racism and social justice rather than medical expertise. Okay, just think of this. These are the doctors that you want to have for the next generation. Rather than medical expertise, or medical education should center on anti-oppression, anti-racism, and social justice. In mathematics, there was a big commission produced a white paper. I shouldn't call it a white paper, probably, but a paper for the state of California entitled A Pathway to Equitable Math Instruction, Dismantling Racism in Mathematics Instruction. It was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with partners that included the Lawrence Hall of Science and UC Berkeley. Here's some of the statements in this thing. The concept of mathematics being purely objective is unequivocally false. We see white supremacy culture show up in the mathematics classroom even as we carry out our professional responsibilities. Using this standards as a framework, we see white supremacy culture in the mathematics curriculum can show up when, quote, there's a greater focus on getting the right answer than understanding. Students are required to show their work in standardized ways. Independent practice is valued over teamwork or collaboration. Math is taught in a linear fashion and skills are taught sequentially. Now, I'm all in favor of rethinking how to teach math and to do it effectively. And some of these aspects may not be the most effective ways to do math, but to argue that they're racist and white supremacist because of requiring students to get the right answer is just simply ludicrous. Astrobiology, which I've argued is perhaps one of the most fields where social justice has impacted the most. In a Scientific American article, Scientific American used to be a reputable journal, I used to write for it, an article entitled Cultural Bias Distorts the Search for Alien Life. Decolonizing the search for extraterrestrial intelligence could boost its chances of success. Instead of listening for signs of alien intelligence, we should be first listening to indigenous people here on Earth, or she put it, taking into account marginalized and historically excluded perspectives. At a large SETI meeting recently at Penn State, it was decided to forbid using the word intelligence, as in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence or intelligent life, as it is a white construct. Let's get back to archaeology again. The Society of American Archaeology censored a talk by Weiss and a colleague that was concerned about creationism creeping into archaeology. We are concerned. I spent a large fraction of my time 25 years ago fighting so that evolution would remain in the science curriculum in high schools and creationism wouldn't be part of the science curriculum. But we seem to not mind it when it involves indigenous science or indigenous claims. The scientists argue that the current Native American Repatriation Act allows repatriation decisions to be made on the basis of indigenous creation stories. And they argued that that was basically inappropriate, and they were called anti-indigenous, racist, and part of white supremacy. When it comes to indigenous science, perhaps nowhere is as extreme as New Zealand. 2 years ago, the Ministry of Education implemented a policy that Maori ways of knowing would have equal standing with Western science in science classes. 2 members of a group of scientists who publicly questioned the scientific rationale for the policy were investigated for removal by the Royal Society of New Zealand, and 2 members were removed from teaching evolution classes at the University of Auckland. Again, this was from a recent Wall Street Journal piece by Elizabeth Weiss as well. The American Museum of Natural History has a new hall, the Northwest Coast Hall. It includes a case with a warning label. This display case contains items used in the practices of traditional Tlingit doctors. Some may wish to avoid this area, as Tlingit tradition holds that such belongings contain powerful spirits. Another case, talking about history, said, the painted panel displayed above commemorates events experienced by chief of the tribe whose name I can't pronounce right, I'm sure, so I won't, around 1850. While taking salmon from a trap on the cascading Sprout River, the chief lost his balance and fell in a deep pool. 2 supernatural whales called out to him and took him on his journey. In the course of his travels, he entered the lake above the river, met a thunderbird and a lightning serpent, and visited the House of Wolves. Now, the point is, it's fine to celebrate the culture and mythology of this group, but to argue its history is simply, and to conflate history with mythology is inappropriate at best. In my own area, another area I work in, astronomy, the American Astronomical Society considered in 2023 removing the names of authors accused of sexual harassment from their academic papers in AAS journals. Now, this conflicted with a warning from the former president, it's Paula, not Paul, I should say Paula, published a note warning against this, saying it would be, because this has been talked about for a while, saying it would conflict with the AAS ethics code that all persons who've made significant contributions to a work intended for publication should be offered the opportunity to be listed as authors. To do otherwise, most of us would call this plagiarism. But nevertheless, this year, the Code of Ethics was amended that anyone under a current AAS ethics violation sanction cannot be included as an author, but may be named in the acknowledgements with a simple statement such as, we acknowledge the contributions to this work. So someone who's basically produced the scientific research cannot have their names appear in AAS publications if for some reason or other they are prescribed. Once again, astrobiology, going back to the famous case of that young woman who was refused to be able to present her research because she collaborated with a prescribed individual. Jason Wright, director of the SETI Center at Penn State, in defending their decision to bar her from discussing any research she's done with such individuals, said, and I think this is particularly telling, one should not discriminate on matters that have nothing to do with science, especially against minoritized individuals. The implication being, of course, one shouldn't discriminate on matters that have nothing to do with science, but it's fine to discriminate on matters that have to do with science. The implicit assumption is, when it comes to science, discrimination's okay if I don't like you or I don't like someone you're working with. That's just not the way science should progress. So, to conclude, and leave enough time for questions, I hope. Look, when political and subjective moral goals are imposed on the process and governance of science, even if they're well motivated, and I would argue that most of the motivation of DEI programs was initially well motivated, equality, helping people, helping diversify the workforce. All of that sounds fine. But even if they're well motivated, when they're imposed on the process of science and the governance of science, they distort and stifle the search for knowledge. And there's a long history of that. Social justice goals at the root of the problem are well motivated by such ideas as equality, but they do harm. And you only have to look at examples from Lysenko and the Stalinist campaign against genetics to the McCarthy, I didn't put it here, the McCarthy campaign, which removed many academics, including ultimately Oppenheimer, from doing his work, and to the Nazi commendation of Jewish science. All of these women say are obviously evil in principle, but the people who are doing them thought they were well-motivated, and they provide us with fair warning of the consequences of imposing ideology upon the process of science. But I want to end on an upbeat note, because the history of science has some good examples. And as my colleague, the chemist Anna Krylov, reminded me and wrote about in a paper, she pointed out when Anton von Leeuwenhoek's pioneering development of microscopy led to his discovery of spermatozoa in semen, he was concerned that communicating his new results might cause offense. As he put it, when communicating his results to the President of the Royal Society for publication in its philosophical transactions, if your lordship should consider these observations may disgust or scandalize the learned, I earnestly beg your lordship to regard them as private and to publish them or destroy them as your lordship sees fit. Happily, way back then, offense didn't matter. And fortunately for the progress of biology, his lordship wasn't concerned about offense and his results were published. That's the way science should be done. And anything else gets in the way. And that's the attack on science that I wanted to discuss here. Thank you. Okay, I wasn't looking at the webinar chat while I was doing that because I was looking at my slides, and it looks
Of course, yeah.
it looks like there's been a lot here. So I'm happy to go over things.
Yeah, it's a rich stream of questions coming in. Thanks, Lawrence, for that that sobering presentation. Now, in looking over the questions, a common theme seems to be, okay, we're in this fix. How do we get out of it? And that's been something that we have been concerned with pretty extensively here at the National Association of Scholars. And the sweeping of this postmodern ideology through the sciences is actually one of the most striking phenomena of my career, and it's dismaying as it is to you. But as you pointed out correctly, this kind of trend has been unfolding for literally decades, and we're seeing it quite prominently now because this is kind of the fulmination of a rampaging infection of some sort. And the problem is, and I'll just pose this question. I'll try to summarize some of the some of the questions that have come from the people. There are two problems. One is that this didn't arise by itself. It arose because the sciences are heavily dependent these days on funding from government, and whenever that happens, you inevitably have a political agenda there. There's always strings attached. And then the second is that this phenomenon has been building for so long that you have now had one, perhaps two generations of scientists who've been coming through their careers, and just the demographics of this are a formidable problem. Old people like you and I who are retired, we came up in a very different scientific culture, but now the incentives all are towards people who have these kinds of quasi-postmodern philosophies. And increasingly with time, they're becoming the dominant force in academia. And so how do we get the sciences back from this?
Of course, it's a great question. If there were a magic bullet, I'd use it. But I think that you're absolutely right that of course this is self-selecting, and if you select on people who buy into that, even look, I remember I was in Russia a long time ago in 1967, and it was clear then that people listened to the news but knew it was garbage, right? But they couldn't talk about it, but they all realized it was nonsense. Now there are a significant fraction, and I see one of the questions we'll get to, of scientists who think this is nonsense, but I have to do it in order to be supported. Okay, but there are, as you point out, by selecting on this, you're building a group of true believers. And I should say that the true believers, apparent true believers, include very senior people who are as old as you and I, or at least they talk as if they have those things. And that's the problem. I think the only way this will ultimately change, well, it's two ways. One, when it becomes so ridiculous that people, look, most academics keep their head below the radar. That's what they do for most of their life. They want to get funded. Scientists want to get funded. They want to do their stuff. They don't want to put their heads up so they'll get asked to do something they don't want to do or get in trouble. So the idea is to basically try and just keep doing your work, which is a great approach, of course. But that means that people will not speak out, and for good reason, because they see what happens to people who speak out. But the real problem is not that I think that people are afraid of speaking out, which is, of course, a problem, but rather that the people who are in charge, the presidents of universities, heads of the NIH, the DOE, the American Physical Society, the people who are the role models, do not have the courage to speak out, would rather look at things and go ahead of with virtue signalings, get ahead of the mob, rather than simply say this is not acceptable. And I presented, I don't want to get into the politics of what's going on right now in the Middle East, but I presented a picture for a reason. I mean, those university presidents are key examples of people who are afraid to say something is wrong for fear that they'll be stigmatized. And universities depend tremendously on money and donors and students. Now, of course, what's happening in the case of that particular case is that donors are standing up, and there's a big donor who's just who to Harvard, who was also on their corporation, who's left and is speaking out against a number of things we're talking about, and it's clearing to just wake up about what's going on. I think if change may happen, if ultra wealthy individuals realize that universities are not necessarily going in the right direction and are not willing to support that, in one hand. But secondly, I think it's only going to happen when ultimately institutional leaders are willing to lead. And I view them as the real source of this problem. Now, one of the problems with this is that the institutional leaders are not in control. In many universities, the DEI bureaucracy is in control. They answer to no one. And everyone it is very reminiscent of McCarthyism, of everyone, no matter, or the French Revolution, or whatever you want to put it, everyone, no matter what their rank, can be taken down. So I think we need a set of leaders who are willing to speak out and ultimately speak out on behalf of free inquiry and academic freedom as the basis of scholarship, not just in science, but throughout all fields of scholarship, as essential, and that anything that gets in the way of it is simply in the way of it. And that the purpose, as Larry Summers said, the purpose of the university is not to instill moral guidelines to people, not to promote social justice. It's not the purpose of a university. The purpose of the university is to presumably lead to a more just society by educating people who can think. But the other way I think it's going to potentially end is, again, sort of reminiscent of what happened at the end of the latter stages of the McCarthy era. When those faculty who are keeping their head below the radar ultimately realize that they're threatened and that the situation has become so insane that they can't help but respond, then you'll see change. And again, I guess I'm influenced here by an old friend and teacher, Noam Chomsky. When I was at MIT, I took his course in American foreign policy, whether you like him or not. But what he pointed out was that academics were basically the last people to come around being against the Vietnam War. students started it. But eventually, when there's enough people who are speaking out about the silliness, and again, I hesitate to say this, but I say things regardless of if I think they're true, regardless of what the consequence might be. But as awful and terrible as what's going on in the Middle East right now, what we saw in Congress last week, and what we see with student groups and university leaders who call microaggressions violence if you misgender someone, but talk about the awful things that were done to people, real violence, as being acceptable language. I think that dichotomy is finally coming across, and it might be a trigger to help counter this notion of all of the oppressions that on which DEI is based in universities. So as bad as it is, and I wish it had never happened, and I wish the consequences of what it caused have never happened, and I'm sorry for what's going on now. One of the good things that may come out of it is at least a realization of how ridiculous the victim psychology at the basis of modern universities is.
Yeah, the one always hopes for a Ceausescu style preference cascade. One shouldn't underestimate the power of that sort of thing, and one earnestly hopes for it, but of course it's unpredictable when that happens. One never knows when a whole population is going to be pushed over the edge in the way that preference cascades work. But you mentioned that donors have a real possibility to influence things. That certainly is applicable to institutions with very large endowments that depend on these things from large donors. But of course, the reason the donors have influence is that they bring lots of money to the table, and if university presidents have any function at all, it's to ensure the fiscal health of the university. And this brings up the other question, which I think a lot of scientists aren't willing to grapple with, and that is that the major other source of money coming into the sciences is actually from federal government sponsorship of research. And this has been increasing exponentially ever since 1950, when the National Science Foundation was founded. And universities profit a great deal from these revenue streams. And our friend Richard Lindzen, who I think you probably know, he's often famously said, there's just too much money in science. And could the solution be that maybe we should scale back on the amount of government funding of science?
I mean, I guess here's where our political things disagree. Most of the science that I know of in the fields that I work in could not exist without government funding of science. And take particle accelerators, which are among and telescopes, which are among the most expensive government projects around. Yeah. Let's take the superconducting super collider, which was killed in the U.S. 40 years ago. Supposed to be a $10 billion machine, and ultimately that was killed for a variety of reasons. But one, it seemed too expensive, or whatever. And I think the point is that if physicists could do it cheaper, they would do it cheaper. And I think that we have to recognize we are moving in some sense to a more like the Renaissance, where we're seeing rich people like Elon Musk or Yuri Milner or other billionaires beginning to fund research that they like. And I'm all in favor of that. Of course, that should not, however, be a replacement for the government, which is, after all, based on, in principle, in a democratic society, for the will of the people. Government support of the programs that are deemed to be important for the health of the nation in one way or another, and deemed to be important by people who are looking at the science, not the politics. One of my favorite quotes comes from Robert Wilson, who was the first director of the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. And he was called before Congress and asked if it would help aid in the defense of the nation. And he said, no, but it'll help keep the nation worth defending. And I think that's important. I just think you're right. Money is huge, and it affects universities. And university presidents have become basically salesmen. There used to be intellectual leaders, and most of them aren't, as you can tell by listening to them. Most of them, they're spending 90% of their time trying to raise money. But it's worth realizing that in lots of institutions, like the University of California system, the biggest increase in costs is the incredible DEI infrastructure. $200 to $300 million in increased costs just to have these 200 or 300 bureaucrats who should not be the ones that are governing academia. They should be faculty. And so these huge costs which are burgeoning are not just due to the costs of the scientific enterprise themselves. There's this incredible bureaucracy. Now that could be stopped. All universities would be better off if that was just stopped like that, and that money was used for supporting students. If you want really interested in diversity, so give them all scholarships, and if you want to support more faculty and bring in better people from around the world. So I think I just don't think government support of science is the problem. It is true that universities, the system is such that universities profit off it and require it by overhead, and we might want to think about that. But again, as someone who's in an area of science which has required that kind of funding, I'm a theorist, so I'm cheap, but for the experimentalists, I mean, I'm easy, and I could exist off the Xerox costs of the Large Hadron Collider.
You raise a really interesting point there about, there are indeed certain programs that really do need some kind of government support.
I think all the major initiatives do. I just don't think there's a business model, even for going to Mars, like my friend Elon Musk wants to do. I think when you think about it, or mining asteroids, as some people think is a business, I can't see it. I don't see any business model that can do anything like that, because the returns are so far down the road that only governments work. And let's not forget, I remember in the old days being part of a program, I think it was actually through the National Academy, actually, it still didn't think it was a particularly useful organization then either, but it was called, I forget what it was called then, but the study pointed out that 50% of the gross national product of the United States was due to curiosity-driven research investments made a generation or two earlier, rather than applied. You've got to be able to, and the only people who can fund curiosity-driven research are either monopolies, like Bell Labs used to be, or government, because businesses are working on the bottom line, and they can't, unless they have monopoly or something close to it, they can't afford the luxury of just saying go off and do whatever you want and come back in 10 years.
I mean, certainly with space exploration and the Hubble telescope and the Webb telescope and the particle accelerator initiatives that you're talking about, yes, government funding is essential for that sort of thing. But even there, I recall this example, and I don't remember the details, but you'll remember it. A team landed a probe on a comet, and one of the people involved in that showed up at the press conference wearing a shirt that offended some people on it, and so this kind of influence is pervasive, and it always goes along with the funding of government. In
fact, governments are political by their very nature, but in principle,
they should. Yes.
In principle, government should ultimately and should be advised by I don't think scientists, everyone says we need more scientists in government. Not necessarily, in my opinion. Scientists should advise government. Government should take the advice of scientists on what areas are most promising, and then decide what funding to give, and then get out of the way, and let the scientists and let the academic community decide. And that's the way it works well. And you know what? I mean, it's worked pretty well on the whole. If you look at since the Manhattan Project, since the Second World War, and you look at what's been able to be done in science by that model. Again, it's like democracy. It may be a crummy system. It's better than all the others, and maybe. Anyway, I'm wondering if I'm looking at these Q&As, can I go through some of them in detail?
Of course, yes, of course. Absolutely, do it,
Sure, because I can answer them quickly, and I feel bad if we don't get to them. Ed Ed Geringer asks, to what extent do these statements represent the actual views of the members as opposed to the posturing of activists? Well, of course, they all begin as the posturing of activists. But I was but um, but the people I'm talking about are not activists unless you take the head of the NIH as activists. I think what you see is that maybe it's posturing, but every department, and if you look at the great study that Saylor did, these are committees of faculty who are making decisions on hiring with the same kind of verbiage. Now, whether they have Stockholm syndrome, or whether they've been brainwashed, or whether they're just trying to say the right things, I guess to me, the actions speak louder than the words, and the actions suggest that they're doing exactly the same things as the activists. So until we see, I do think, as I said earlier, that to Scott, that many faculty just take this as garbage, and it's not something they need to do to get by. But but the actions are causing it to be deeply embedded in every aspect of the process of science and the funding of science, process of academia, the way classes are carried out, every aspect of academia. So anyway, Adrian asked if science majors should take courses of philosophy of science. My own opinion is no. It's not bad. I'm always in favor of learning history or science. I mean, any extra classes are great. But I think what most young scientists learn about how to do science is not from reading the philosophy of science, not from reading Kuhn or any of the others. You pick your favorite one. It's from doing it. It's from watching how their mentors operate and how science is carried out. Skepticism, constant testing, a dialectic, being willing to disagree, retesting, recognizing that ideas that seem to work may not work universally. All of the things that really the philosophers codify when they talk about the philosophy of science. But for students, I think it's better, for science students, it's better to see in action than in philosophy classes. Not to say, and I often people think I hate philosophy. I don't. But that's not to say that taking philosophy courses is a bad thing. I'm sure it's a great thing. Taking science history class. I'm fascinated by science history. But I don't think we should require it as much as require students to experience science firsthand in the laboratory and in the classroom. Randy says, why do scientists agree with fundamentalist wokeism in private but support in public? Well, the same reasons that the Russians used to in the Soviet Union when I used to visit, because many of them are concerned about their well-being. And I would say that academics on a whole are a very timid group. Academia is a very safe place to be, contrary to maybe some expectations. And most academics are afraid of controversy, creating controversy or potential threats, especially when there's social networking and when you can see that your own career, your own livelihood, your own future can be affected by it. So I understand exactly why many people are afraid to speak out, especially those who figure that by not speaking out, they can insulate themselves against it. That's why I said to Scott earlier, ultimately, I think we're going to see more people speaking out when they see themselves and their near friends affected, and they think they're there, but for the grace of God, go I. There, that famous thing, they came for the lawyers, now they're coming for me. Does it make a difference in the course reversal when dealing with a public or private institution? It does, I think. Private institutions are less accountable. Now, they're accountable to their donors, as we'll see what happens to Harvard and Penn. Recently, as you probably heard today, $100 million donor is considering pulling out because of the Penn. I don't think that president will last the end of the week. We'll see. But and that would be a good thing, I think. But anyway, private universities respond to money and are not legislated. I mean, to a certain extent, to get accreditation, they have to do things. Public universities are much more accountable, and that's both a good and bad thing, because they can be politicized much more. I mean, we've seen in Florida, some people in this group might love what the governor of Florida has been doing. I don't particularly, but I don't think the legislature should legislate what people are allowed to say. what they should ensure is that the public institutions allow people free speech, and 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 that nothing is sacred in a university, but they shouldn't say you can't talk about this or you can't talk about that. But so anyway, you can see it. I think when one's looking at ways to change things, one can sue public institutions a lot more effectively than one can private institutions. I think, Ed, you got it wrong. The Berkeley Life Sciences position was a real position, but it had to defend DEI. It wasn't a DEI position. It was a research position. Well, from the iPhone person, it is going to create consequences, and I think we'll see that. And I'll tell you where some of the consequences are coming right now. And I have to say, I'm sure my politics are to the left of many people here, but I'm going to sound like I'm right wing. I've seen look, researchers vote with their feet. They don't give a hoot. They want to go where they can do the best science. I remember when I was at Yale, I kept telling people, Yale, you can't just get good scientists by saying you're at Yale. That means nothing. Good scientist needs laboratory and support. They don't care about all the rest of the stuff. But it's true nationally. And you see people vote with their feet. People came to the United States, immigrants, because it was the best place to do research and study. And it's been great for the United States and on the whole, great for their own countries. You're seeing people leave the United States to do research elsewhere. In fact, and not just the United States. One of my favorite stories, or least favorite stories, depending upon how you put it, is an Australian researcher who went to China to do his research because he found in the lab it was freer. As a foreigner, first of all, he was freer, but he was free to discuss anything more or less in the lab, more free than he was in Australia. And so I think you're going to see scientific development. Once, what will really happen is when the key leadership of scientific programs moves out of the West, as it is happening in various places, you may see a backlash, and you may say, oh, we have to begin to concentrate more on quality and merit than on posturing and identity. And I hate to say it, but that may be the way the change comes about. What can the older generations of scientists do to support young scientists? I think speak out as older scientists who presumably have, I was going to say have less to lose. They may have more to lose, and I was going to say are more productive, but it's not, tenure doesn't mean anything anymore in that regard. I think, but if you really believe you're trying to help young scientists, first of all, tell them this too shall pass, that they should concentrate whatever they do in order to get their job. In the long run, they should concentrate on the science and encourage them to concentrate on the science and support their efforts to concentrate on the science. And also remind them, as I do people who are attacked, I always try and write people who've been attacked, that there's a lot of us who are supporting them, and that there is a group, that they're not alone. So I think those are really important things to say to everyone, not just young scientists. I mean, it sounds trite, and I wish I had a more beautiful thing to say to that, but I don't. Is there a role, as much as we call the idea of state influencing universities, is there a role when university itself is unable to maintain academic freedom? Well, look, part of the problem of all of these rules about codes of conduct and everything else is they're unnecessary, because the really bad stuff is already illegal. And universities don't need to police it with groups of people who are not accountable to anyone, and most of the time don't have any ideas of due process, free speech, or anything else. So I think if universities are not allowing academic freedom, then there is a role for the state to say, you don't get certified as a university unless you can demonstrate at some level that you're encouraging the free and open inquiry. I say that hesitantly, because I know that governments will always input in there, just like, as I said, the motivation behind DEI was a good one. They'll think they're doing the right thing by saying, we want academic freedom, but that really means is X, Y, or Z, and it's that X, Y, or Z isn't academic freedom. So I'm always wary about government intrusion in academia, but I do think that some basic standards need to be met for funding and accreditation. Um, um, it said Paul says appealing to value is brought at this point. It seems oxymoronic. Maybe, I mean, academic freedom should be, and the purpose of tenure was to encourage you to be able to say anything, to offend people, to provoke people, to have open discussion, and and uh, and it's at the heart of scholarship and academia. And if it's not there, then there's no sense doing it, in my mind. It's really at the heart of everything. I don't need to tell this group that the real purpose of academic freedom and freedom of speech is not to give you the freedom to say what you want, but to give others the freedom to learn that they're wrong by potentially hearing you. And it's not me, and I learned that from Hitchens, but Hitchens got it from Hume or someone else. Donors, I do know there are programs of donors who are beginning to think about how to affect, and you can see it. Ackman, I think is his name. I forget his name now. The person who speaking out against Harvard. He is actively speaking out about and talking about, and other donors are speaking out. And again, it was in response to the Israel thing, in response to the anti-Semitic and to the calls for genocide. It's an awful reason to have something good happen, but at least maybe, as I say, it'll happen in the right direction. What do I think of new universities like Austin U? I'm more skeptical, frankly, that they'll be able to. I mean, they're good. Look, they'll be fine institutions of learning. I don't think they're going to suddenly turn people away from Harvard or Penn or Princeton or places which basically are research universities, not teaching universities. They're research universities, and research universities, as Scott bemoaned, are research universities because of money and because of talent. And until institutions can compete on that level, I think there'll be great liberal arts colleges. But there already are great liberal arts colleges. I don't think. Look, my speech was all negative, but that does not mean you can't get a good education in this country, and it does not mean that there aren't great teachers and there aren't colleges where you can be encouraged to think, especially by your peers, your fellow students. But if you want to, but I don't think, so I think Austin U will be an interesting liberal arts college. I also am skeptical because, I see the people who are teaching, and some of them are my friends, but at some level, you have to search committees and arguing that, people have to have, beyond being really, really charismatic, that when it comes to certain disciplines, you have to have expertise as well. And I think that has to be verified in all hiring. I'm a big promoter of merit as a former chair of my department and otherwise.
Okay, we've reached the end of our time today. I wish we could go on because there are tons of really interesting questions sitting in the Q&A and also
I
in
tried to get the ones I saw,
in the chat box. Yes, thank you for that. You did a magnificent job on that, Lawrence. But this is a good time to reiterate that if we didn't get to your question, I encourage you to send them on to me. At my email address, that's turner@nas.org. We can carry on this conversation by email or what have you afterwards. I'll forward your questions onto Lawrence. And again, I'll just remind everyone that the comment section of the YouTube video is a great place to post questions. I pay attention to it. I'm sure Lawrence will as well, and we might be able to respond to that. Okay, so we've, as I said, reached the end of our time. Thank you all for supporting this. If you're a member, thank you for your ongoing generosity. If you're not, maybe you can consider joining us. And it just remains for me to thank you, Lawrence, for coming on and to invite you to offer any final thoughts that you might have.
Well, thanks for doing this. Thanks for having these webinars and conversations, and this is the kind of thing I think we need more often, which is why I tried to personally put some energy into the talk. And again, I'm sorry, the questions were great questions. I wish I had great answers to all the great questions, but keep up the good work and keep speaking out. I think that's what we all have to do.
Yeah, good message. Okay, Lawrence Krauss, thank you very much for appearing on Restoring the Sciences, and
Thank you.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions coming your way after this. Okay,
Take
good
care.
night, everyone,
Good night.
or good day, everyone, wherever you are.